I cannot think of a more appropriate way to tee this panel up than that video. Welcome, everyone, to a session called Best Laid Plans. I have to give Benton total credit for that, but I would like to thank them for taking a chance on me. This is a privilege and a pleasure to welcome a panel. I am very much intimidated, but I'll pretend that I am not. So I'll begin with the way I wrote it, not necessarily the way people have appeared before you. So I became aware of Blair Levin's depth during his service as chief of staff of the FCC during President Clinton's term. But I was afforded the opportunity to interact with him and his team during President Obama's term as he oversaw the development of the National Broadband Plan. Blair is everyone's, and I mean everyone's, senior non-resident fellow. Now, there are a couple of institutions like Brookings, but trust me, on more than one occasion, he has been my senior, you hear what I'm saying, non-resident fellow. And he currently serves as senior advisor at New Street Research. Next to me is Larry Irving, former Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Communications and Information and Administrator at NTIA, a lot of ands in that. He was a force, as you know, in shifting the policy narrative on domestic and international internet policy. Inducted in the Internet Hall of Fame in 2019, he paid me to say that. Irving's team produced the first empirical study proving the existence of the digital divide. This groundbreaking research, everyone will note, sparked and continues to inform global efforts to study and eliminate technology access disadvantages. I struggled with how to, because I don't know, can we still say divide? Anyway, we'll talk about that later. I met next to you, Rochelle Chong, during our days as state regulatory commissioners, but quickly learned more about her history-making appointment to the Federal Communications Commission during the Telecom Act era. As both the youngest member of the commission at the time and the first Asian American to serve, Rochelle, I know you know this, was a force. And I mean force like I'm scared of her force. At NARUC during her federal joint board service and state commission years. She went on to create the California Advanced Services Fund at the California Public Service Commission and is currently a strategic consultant, a regulatory lawyer, and is active with Shelby. She's claimed she is tired, but I don't believe her. Christopher Wright has been the head of the appellate group at Harris, Wilshire, and Grannis since 2001, but many of you got to know Chris real well as general counsel at the Federal Communications Commission. I believe it's subject to check. It was from 1997 to 2001, where you played a key role in the implementation of the Telecommunications Act and defending the FCC's early actions. I took a pause there for a reason. Chris is known for, and these are his words, translating complex legal questions into clear, compelling arguments that resonate with generalist lawyers and plain old folk like us. We'll see if he's telling the truth. And of course, we have Jim Kohlenberger, Presidential Technology Advisor is what I call him. Jim served as Chief of Staff of the Office of Science and Technology Policy under President Obama and helped to initiate the 44th President's National Cybersecurity Review, mobile broadband, and open data initiatives, among just a few things that he did under that era. He also served 8 years in the Clinton White House as Senior Domestic Policy Advisor around innovation, technology, and telecommunications. The president of JK Strategies is a public policy consulting. He has a consulting practice and serves on the board of the Benton Institute. Yes, they all paid me to say that last line. So I'll start with Larry. If you give a couple of moments of an opening statement to set the tone in the stage. No, they did not get up. So that's why I got that little look. Did you notice the little look that he just gave me? I am going to start with you. And if you can open it up and welcome.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Clyburn. It's fitting in some ways that we're here in the Barbara Jordan building because my path toward thinking about universal service really started with her successor. People don't realize that Barbara Jordan was only in Congress for about 4 to 6 years. And when she left Congress in 1978, a young man named Mickey Leland, a name that many of you, particularly those of you under 30, have never heard of, but Mickey Leland succeeded her. And when we talk about Lifeline, we talk about universal service, we talk about the connecting the underserved, Mickey really started it. The FCC's Lifeline rule that in the 80s would not have happened, but for Mickey pushing the then chairman of the FCC to look at those issues, which most people, or many people, don't recognize or realize. I've had the great good fortune of not only working for Mickey, but working for Ed Markey and then working for Al Gore and Bill Clinton. My cousin was a public service commissioner here in Washington, D.C., and I was working for Mickey Leland, and she called, a woman named Pat Worthy. She's a professor at Howard Law School, and she came to me and said, there's a problem with regard to low-income people having telephony. And so we went to Congressional Research Service. We started looking at the numbers. If you were Black and grew up in the town I grew up in, Brownsville, New York, you had a 1 in 4 chance of being online. If you were Latino in Mickey's district, you had a 1 in 5 to 1 in 6 chance of being having a telephone line in the 1980s. If you lived on an Indian reservation, you had a 1 in 2 chance of having a telephone line in 1980s. And what that did was that informed us that there was a problem. And the problem was one of cost, but it was also that if you didn't pay your long distance bill, you lost your local service. So we broke those two things up. And Lifeline, and the program doesn't exist anymore, called Link Up, was started in the 1980s. Now, what does that have to do with the internet and universal service? It has a lot to do with it, because from those statistics, from those findings, from those experiences, from going to some and talking to people about what was happening to them, when the internet started in 1993, I realized that anecdote was one thing, but data was something else. And so I had a phenomenal staff. Some of you know Kathy Brown, many of you know Kristen Van Hook, many of you know Laura Breeden, Roanne Robinson, who's enrolled in the Hopi tribe. Just brilliant people with lots of different experiences, and this is why diversity does matter, who could tell me what's happening at state level, what's happening at tribal level, what's happening, communities. We started the first study on who's connected and who's not connected. And then we did a series of studies to show that the divide not only existed, but it was increasing. That empirical data helped inform the debates in Congress and debates in states and debate globally. So I'll stop there, but it really does. I've listened to the conversations all day long about how the Telecommunications Act happened. And it happened because there were lots of strands of important policy that isolated couldn't happen. But if we brought them together, we could get those bills. And to Ed Markey's point, I'll go back to my boss because, it's foundable wisdom for those of us who work for him. Because the big guys were dancing, the ants got to play. All right. And nothing happened to little guys unless the big guys have an incentive to come to the table. And it was enough at stake for the big guys. We were able to do some great things for the little guys.
Thank you so much. And you can tell he's from New York, but then you can also tell he's been around Southerners because I understood every word. I didn't have to. He was, because, Larry can get a lot in, but I appreciate it. And we appreciate you. Rochelle.
Well, I love this panel because I've been mostly laser focused on broadband infrastructure and then digital inclusion since about 2006. Which is when I started the first California Broadband Infrastructure Fund when I was a PUC commissioner. But this brought me back 10 years earlier. And what I remember most about my days at the FCC is that we were very pro-competition. That was really what the Telecom Act meant to me because I had to do all that gory common carrier, letting the R box into the long distance and the long distance and video and all Telric. It brought back a terrible memory of trying to understand Telric and unis and all that. But, this was the sexy good news part that I loved about the Telecom Act, which is the importance of universal service. And I'll tell you a quick story. I did a lot of being vetted when I became an FCC commissioner. It was completely just luck. But one of the things that I did do is they let me go in and they had me meet the vice president. And he sat me down on his yellow silk couch, which is so tall that my feet didn't touch. So my feet were like swinging like a little kid. And I felt very young. And he said, "Do you know what the internet is, Ms. Chong?" And I said, "Yes, sir." I think he called it the information superhighway at that time. But I said, "Yes, I do know what it is. I'm in California and I'm actually an early adopter of computers. Yes, it's very important." And he talked to me about his dream of making sure that as we develop computer technology, that those who were poor, those in underdeveloped countries like Africa, would have access to these advanced technologies. And he told me that was one of his most important goals as vice president, and could I help him get that done at the FCC? And that made such a huge impression on me that when the Telecom Act passed, I was just chomping at the bit to work on the E-rate portion, because I knew that was very important to the vice president. And as it turns out, it became one of the most important things that I feel that I contributed in my public service as both a PUC commissioner and an FCC commissioner. And it played out later when John Windhausen got me onto his Shelby board. And we've been working very intently on making sure that schools, libraries, and rural healthcare companies still have adequate funds to do what they need to do. So we will talk later about everything the FCC had to do in that act, but I am so proud that universal service was the most enduring thing that we did. And later we should talk about the fight that we had about the cap, because as we were interpreting the E-rate for the first time, there was a massive fight about putting caps on because of fiscal conservatism.
Thank you, and Jim.
Well, thank you, and it's great to be here, and it's great to be here among so many great friends. And the last panel was just awesome, and kind of takes me back in time. And I was really fortunate, and I love these videos that Benton has been playing back with Al Gore, and I was super fortunate to have been with Gore for many years, and fortunate to have worked with a president and a vice president who had a vision for the future, who cared about what mattered, who understood that technology could help improve people's lives, that expanding the internet could be an opportunity equalizer, that we could also create a economic accelerant throughout the economy. And for us, I love the panel. I love the question on the last panel about vision, and we were all about implementing not a Telecom Act. We were about implementing a vision of the future. And for us, our vision of that started way before, with Al Gore and Ed Markey back on the committee. And at first they had a bill to put computers in every classroom. In 1985, they had a bill. Gore connected the first 5 supercomputers with high-speed fiber, 56 kilobits per second. But that became the backbone of the internet. In 1991, we he authored the High Performance Computing Act, also called the Gore Bill. The Gore Bill then connected universities to this network, and it included this grant program about connecting multimedia. That led to a little kid named Mark Andreessen, who got a grant from that program and created the web browser. In '92, we did the Cable Act. In '93, when we got into office, we through the NSF, we helped fund this group called NSI to create the .com network and help explode .com. We funded something at the NSF called the Digital Libraries Initiative. And again, another grantee of that was Sergey Brin, because we were interested in how you could organize this here library of information, and he came up with Search. And we did a whole bunch of other things that, in addition to the act, were all about, in our view, advancing a digital infrastructure and not connecting, computers to the internet, connecting people to broad-based opportunity. And it's just been an historical, amazing set of consequences that we got out of it. And amazingly, a lot of that was because we had people like Larry. We had Joe Stiglitz, a future Nobel Prize winner. We had Tom Khalil. We had a bunch of people on Larry's team. We had Greg Simon, who I wish were here today. Reed was a critical piece, and of course the 6th FCC commissioner, right. Blair, who none of this would have happened without him, and importantly, Chris's role in saving the E-rate. All of these things had to come together in this unique way, or we wouldn't be where we are today.
Well, Jim's going to try to take credit, but I'm glad I did not listen to him. He told me to go right into questions. I think we are benefiting from the historical. So Jim is good in a lot of ways, but you don't have to listen to every single suggestion he makes. So, but I will affirm what he says about what he has said about Blair.
Well, let me make two very quick corrections. First of all, the previous panel said there was a spirit of bipartisanship. That was kind of true, but the bigger truth is there was a spirit of seriousness. There were a lot of laughs and a lot of jokes, but when Rochelle and I were talking, or negotiating or debating, we represented different points of view, but neither one of us was thinking, how do I tweet about this? How do I go on Fox News or MS Now and make a snarky comment about it? It was, everybody involved was really serious and acting in good faith. And I regret that I don't quite see that today. A second thing, Andy said, I quarterbacked it. Actually, the truth is, and there's a really interesting lesson about management here. I spent the entire month of March 96 in California due to a family tragedy. And, but it was everybody else. They were so wonderful about coming together. Gina was incredibly important, but people like Carol Maddy, who's in the audience, we just had an amazing team, and I won't go through all the names, but, so I just wanted to correct those two things. To show you how senior I am, I dropped out of college 53 years ago which is more years than some of you are alive, to work in a campaign to be the driver for Tom Bradley, running for mayor of Los Angeles. Great experience, taught me a lot of things. But one thing it taught me, in part because it's a nonpartisan election, is the real parties are not Democrats and Republicans. They're people who are universalists, who say everyone does better when everyone does better. And they're tribalists, which is the point of politics, is to have me dominate, is to have my team win. And there's a real tension in that. And you see it. I would like to believe that universal service is a great example of people coming together and saying, we need everybody to rise up. But as other people talked about, the farm team was fundamentally, and I'm not blaming them, it was fundamentally about how do we make sure our people get what we need. The E-rate came out of a sense that, more of a universalist sense. I think Lifeline did as well. We're going to have to redo universal service. That's not the point of this panel, but there are obvious implications for how do we change universal service to an AI age. And I just hope we can do it in a spirit of universalism rather than tribalism. But I really fear that the nature of the country's politics these days, and let me just end by saying, I'm grateful to Benton that they published a thing I wrote in which I asked the question, will Donald Trump get rid of Joe Biden's largest DEI program? Of course, you're supposed to say no. After all, Brendan Carr is totally opposed to DEI as is a whole administration. The largest DEI program is the BEAD program. Absolutely. If you read the legislation, it is all about equity and inclusion. But because it is for equity and inclusion for Trump's tribe, by which I mean rural, largely white, not entirely white, but largely white people, it's not considered DEI. And that is a problem that we're all going to have to confront as we try to raise up universal service for the information economy dominated by AI.
We can always count on Blair for a headline. And Chris, I mean that positively, Blair, most days. Yeah, Chris, you might want to drop a line or two about a certain court decision, but I'll leave that to you, how you open things up.
Well, I'd like to start by noting that I was actually at the commission in 96. I came over as deputy general counsel in 94 and was Bill Kennard's deputy general counsel until he became chair in 97.
Thank you. I needed another moment on the web to affirm that.
So I was there, and best laid plans, I see, is our title here. So the 96 Act was a great accomplishment, and the E-rate program, Section 254, was one of the highlights of the act. But let's remember the Supreme Court called it a model of ambiguity, even self-contradiction. A fair amount of what I understood went on was the regional bell companies would hand a subsection to Congress, and the long distance companies would hand them another one, and they throw them both in. And so, the first question was sort of, what's the role of the states here compared to the FCC? And that was a big issue and ultimately got resolved in the FCC's favor. But that was a close case. And while Congress did a lot, I remember a meeting in Blair's office, probably in February of 96, where Ruth Milkman was up at a blackboard and a lot of people in this room were there. And it was pointed out that thank goodness this was a deregulatory law because it expressly required the FCC to conduct 83 separate rulemakings and under tight deadlines. I mean, the first deadline was to do the local competition order in 6 months. I mean, the FCC is not built to do that, but it did. And you know, what do we have? We had 18 months for the universal service order. But everybody at the commission, all the commissioners, were committed to getting this done on time, which was an amazing accomplishment. But it was your office and your blackboard, and you had the people figuring out how to do all of this stuff, which was just an incredible managerial, accomplishment, and I still marvel at that. So,
Chris, let me stick with you, and I don't know where you were headed, but I did read this part of your your background. Litigation shaped so much of what the act eventually became. How did legal challenges change the trajectory of implementation, and were policymakers prepared for that? Chris, I want to open with you.
So, well, let me say that the leadership at the commission was very sophisticated, that, appellate litigation would follow every single important decision. Reed knew that, Bill knew that, Blair knew that, and I'm proud that they brought me in to help work on this thing. But yes, so everybody was aware of that, and OGC, the Office of General Counsel staff, was very much brought into the rulemaking, the order drafting part of the of orders too, not just sort of after the order had been written, but earlier on, when something like, say, the universal service order is being drafted, having in the order the best argument we could make for why there should be an E-rate program, for instance, which, despite what some of the people might have implied earlier today, you could read Section 254, and there's a universal service high cost fund, and that you're supposed to do something with the Lifeline program, and even more vaguely, something for telemedicine. And then the FCC is instructed to, quote, enhance access to advanced telecommunications and information services for schools and libraries. That's a statutory basis for the E-rate program. There's nothing about there shall be a fund, it shall be this large. There's nothing about there's a whole lot that you might think, if you were coming up with a multi-billion-dollar fund, would be in the statute about it, but that was largely missing. But the order, everybody worked together. It is true that enhancing access to telecommunications and advanced services in schools and libraries, definitely a couple of $1 billion will help enhance access. So that was the basis in the order, and in our brief, ultimately in the Fifth Circuit, for which obviously the FCC is being told to do something. Mm-hmm. I knew, Reed and Blair knew, and Bill knew that the authors of the act very much intended there to be an E-rate fund. But, they could have been more clear about it. How's that?
Well, can I just say real quickly, and the last panel talked about some of the things we learned, principles for AI regulation. I agree with everything you said, Gina. Here's the problem. Under the Supreme Court, the Loper-Bright doctrine, the major question doctrine, which undercuts the authority, I don't know that we could get away with it. now. And plus, I mean, the joke about what Gore said about Reed not being independent, by the end of this term of the Supreme Court, the FCC will be under Supreme Court law, not independent. That means everything the FCC does is much harder to get upheld. And one of the things we did, and Chip mentioned this in terms of wireless, to do the pro-competitive stuff that we did, I don't know that any agency can do that now, because the incumbents can so tie things up in the court, particularly because of the major question doctrine. It's going to be very, very difficult. Vague principles just won't cut it with this court.
But can I pick up a little bit on this story on the E-rate, because it was very personal on our side, and I think we had started in the 92 campaign talking about connecting every business, home, school, library. We brought that in. We ran a year-long process, and I think as you've seen on the screen, out of that process, we did a information superhighway summit where we outlined our legislative goals, and particularly the goal of connecting every school, classroom, and library by the year 2000. 2 weeks later, after Al Gore had gone around to each of us and asked, "Is this achievable?" We put that in the State of the Union, and we made that a flagship moment, not just for the Telecom Act, but for the administration. This idea of a young girl from Carthage, Tennessee, being able to reach a hand across a keyboard and reach the Library of Congress. And so, we pushed hard for this in the telecom reform bill. And when we signed the bill, we did it at the Library of Congress as a symbol of that young girl from Carthage of Tennessee accessing the Library of Congress. It was actually the first library hooked up under the Telecom Act, I like to say, because we brought in a 2 gigabit ATM network so that we could connect a school to the Library of Congress as a metaphor for this whole thing, right? Newt Gingrich, Al Gore, Bill Clinton, we all sing the praises of libraries. But as soon as we got to implementing this, and Blair put together an awesome team to help do this, I mean, we all looked at him, and I'll bring Benton into this conversation too. Larry had set up this group called NIAC, the National Information Advisory Council, of which Benton was a part, and they had this Kickstart initiative to try to price out what it would cost to actually connect schools and libraries. And we're like, when CBO scored the Telecom Act, they scored the E-rate as $150 million a year, right? So as Chris points out, there was a little bit of flexibility in there. They'd never put how much it was. And so we kind of went back and forth of like how much this is. Larry's team and our team put together our models with the help of this Kickstart. Blair's team put together another model, and we're like, oh, it's $2.25 billion. And that's what it's going to cost us. And suddenly what was bipartisanship on the Hill became something entirely different. This almost didn't happen because, we had the majority and minority members of the Senate Commerce Committee, minority and majority members of the House Commerce Committee wrote the FCC a letter and said, stop. We had a group of phone companies, long distance companies, or bell companies, go to the Fifth Circuit and said, stop. We had a op-ed that came out in the Washington Post calling this the Gore tax that said, stop. And soon we had a firestorm on our hands. And you said, let's come back to the issue of caps. And because this became the big issue of how we would get through this. And, this wasn't simple and it wasn't easy. Chris helped, thank goodness, get through, and hopefully we can come back to that in a little bit, save the E-rates in the court, although they lopped off the part of the contribution mechanism that had supplied the E-rate. There were 2 subsidy mechanisms that we were looking at, both the USF subsidy mechanisms and the access charge mechanism, and we were trying to use one to play off the other to pay for the other. And make sure that the access charges stayed off the internet. And in the court of public opinion, Larry and others made clear that this was about making sure that kids has access to the jobs and industry, the skills that they would need for the jobs and industries of the futures. We send the president, the vice president out into schools to pull wires and sell this to the public. We built the public on our side in Congress when they were still holding hearings on this being an illegal tax. We finally figured out that if we actually went to the members of Congress who opposed us and we actually connected their civics class in their high schools into that classroom when they were holding a hearing on unplugging kids, that we could get them to shut up. And we had a guy, Congressman Tancredo, who was the one member of Congress who consistently wrote legislation to kill the E-rate. We made sure he lost, and that became a litmus test for all other members of Congress of what happened when you oppose it.
Thanks, Jim. Kristen, Larry, and then Rochelle. I thought I saw your.
Thanks. So I got a big help from an unlikely source in prevailing in the Fifth Circuit on the E-rate, namely Bill Barr. So every company in the world challenged some aspect of the Universal Service Order. And it was one of those things, and it ends up in the Fifth Circuit under the lottery procedure. And so half of the FCBA bar flies to New Orleans in, I think it was December of '98. And there's like 14 different issues of which the E-rate is one. And it's a, 4 hours parade of one lawyer after another getting up and saying that there was something wrong with the Universal Service Order. And as you say, they won on some of them. But from my perspective, the E-rate was the most important issue, and that was the one I really wanted to focus on, make sure we came out ahead. And we had a terrible panel. The presiding judge, Jerry Smith, Reagan appointee, he was on the Federalist Society's, short list for next Supreme Court justice, and he knew he was on that list. So the other, another Reagan appointee and a Bush 41 appointee. So I'm up, and they're very hostile. Jerry's doing all the talking, but he doesn't like the E-rate program. He doesn't see a $2.5 billion fund in this statute. And I'm just saying over and over again, hey, we're enhancing access to advanced services, and they can't tell you, they can't provide you with an interpretation of the statute that allows the FCC to do something that wouldn't include a fund for like the E-rate. And so Judge Smith didn't seem to have an answer to that, but he wasn't happy either. But so as Bill Barr, who led the charge against the E-rate, is coming up to do his rebuttal, even before he gets to the podium, Judge Smith is, can you give me an example of something the FCC could do to implement this statute that wouldn't logically extend to the E-rate? And so Barr said, Your Honor, I'd like to use my precious rebuttal time to discuss the high cost issue, which anybody who's ever done a moot court knows that you can't do that. And Judge Smith said, no, you're not, counsel. You're going to answer my question. And then I was so happy, Barr actually goes back to counsel table and consults. He didn't have an answer to this question, which is like, how could you not have an answer to this question? But he comes back from counsel table and he starts doing the kind of telecom acronym speak that I try to avoid when dealing with judges, not always as successfully as I like, but the court's not understanding him at all. And finally, Judge Smith and I couldn't understand what he was saying either. I think it was just gibberish. I've tried to get a hold of a tape, but apparently they don't have them. Anyway, Judge Smith finally says, oh, counsel, go ahead and talk about your high cost issue. And so at the airport on the way back, I asked one of the other lawyers who'd argued against me earlier, I said, look, I'm going to get asked by the commission, are we going to win the E-rate argument? To which he said, well, Chris, I don't know if you won it, but Barr might have lost it. Anyway.
That's good thing for the country.
And sort of your comments about Chevron. So months go by, and on July 30th, 1999,
We can adjust that mic. We'll be friends.
we get the news that the order is coming down, and the Fifth Circuit's clerk's office is kind enough they've agreed to fax it to us because that was the quickest way to get it then. And so we're in the office of general counsel hanging around the fax machine, and somebody's like pulling off each page, and we got issue 1 and issue 2, issue 5, issue 6. And then they get to the E-rate issue, and one of the first paragraphs of that says that the best reading of the relevant statutory language indicates that the FCC exceeded its authority by mandating discounts for internet access and internal connections. And then the fax machine breaks. So we're sitting there, and finally the fax machine starts working again, and we jump to the end of that section, and here's what the holding says. It's, even though GTA has offered a persuasive reading of the statutes, its plain language does not make Congress's intent sufficiently unambiguous for Chevron's Step 1 review. Therefore, we defer to the FCC's interpretation under Chevron's Step 2 and affirm those aspects of the order providing internet services and internal connections to schools and libraries. So the E-rate program survived barely. Probably wouldn't under Loper Bright, at least with this panel. But here's a toast to Bill Barr for not being able to give him an example.
I noticed Larry's, thank you. I've noticed Larry's body language, and then I will.
I'm going to be very brief. First, I wonder how many of you all have ever actually received a fax with all these young faces out here, like long distance and local. But going back to the things Jim was talking about, the net days were really important to E-rate. Net days went, for those of you who, most of you don't remember, but you literally had the president, the vice president, my boss, Ron Brown, and other senior government officials, the Secretary of Education, Riley, running around to various schools, hospitals, libraries, clinics, pulling wires, showing, we worked closely with Sun, John Gage of Sun. There were like senior people from big companies where we're going to connect these schools, hospitals, libraries, and people weren't connected. Two things about that. On one net day, I went with Ron Brown down to Cupertino, and we were at a place that was Apple had outfitted with all of these beautiful technologies. Every kid was sitting at a table, and every table had 5 iMacs, which are these little bubble-looking Apple computers. And these kids were surfing around the internet. And this is 1994, late 94, early 95. No, early 93, early 94. We went up to another school, Thurgood Marshall High School in San Francisco. Ron and I did, and those kids didn't know a computer existed. And seriously, that day, seeing that dichotomy is what caused me to think about we need to have data. I could tell the story a million times, but the data would tell a better story. And that's where the digital divide really comes from. That day with Ron Brown on a net day. The other thing that matters is you go down to Hal Rogers is a traditional Republican. I think he may be the oldest member of Congress still, but he was my Appropriations Committee chairman. And he sent me down to Pikesville, Kentucky, which was heart of his district. And I went down and I talked to parents and looked them in the eye and said, what would make the biggest difference in the lives of your children? And Representative Rogers was there, and he said, if my kid could have access to the internet, and I can't afford it, but my school can. Those are the kinds of real life stories. Those are the things that happen. Our motto in the Clinton administration is putting people first. Anytime you got people in real situations with real stories and talked about it was going to change their children's lives, that's when you got contact with those members of Congress.
Rochelle, I didn't want to leave you out, but I'm not forcing. I would not get that same deference, but anyway.
Okay, so just one quick story. You do have to consult with the states when you do something like the E-rate. And so the quick story I'm just going to tell is that we did have a state federal joint board that was addressing E-rate, and it was a very contentious issue. I've gotten yelled at probably 6 times when I was a public servant, and this was the only time I got yelled at by various commissioners, both federal and state, all within maybe 24 hours. So it gives you an idea of how passionate people were about this program and how important it was. And what I can remember, it was a long time ago, was that it had to do with the cap that was being proposed because of the cost issue, right? And I'm a Republican, so I have to care about costs. And we had, I think, Laska Schoenberg, Cheryl Perino, Sharon Nelson from state of Washington. I'm trying to remember who else was on there. But there were a lot of them that were very concerned about costs. And so there was an intense amount of discussion. There were, I think, only 2 FCC commissioners on the joint board, and I think 4 state commissioners, sounds right. But it was very intense. But what I will tell you is, we really wanted to make sure that this was funded. On the other hand, we were trying to be responsible because there was this quote that it was going to be $2.5 billion. And, a B back then was really a lot of money. So we were trying to figure out a way that we do it over time and, all those types of things that you can do. But I will tell you that in the end, even though it was just a gory, very emotional and difficult process, we did reach agreement. And in the end, we were all really proud that we reached agreement and we got it done. So I just want you to know that it was a hard slog, but we all knew we were doing the right thing.
Speaking of agreement or lack thereof, I've heard at least 3 times reference to the universal service funding mechanism. You can't go to a NARUC and speak about anything telecom or including broadband and not hear about the strains legally and financially. Do you have anything to share about step next, or what changes should we make, or any words of wisdom that will get things moving in a direction for any type of resolve? Blair, I'll start with you, since you're giving me a kind of look that I really don't understand.
I can safely predict nothing will happen.
But what should happen?
Oh, that's how much time do we have?
You know the score.
Yeah. No, look, it appeared in 2023 and 2024 that a bipartisan consensus was emerging that the tech community should pay for the continuation of universal service. One can argue about the merits of that. What you can't argue about is that the current system, which depends on a shrinking fund while demand is growing, is going to eventually hit a tipping point. Now, I have to admit, my predictions are not always accurate. I thought that when it hit 10% contribution factor, there would be a revolt. We're now at about 40. But it is amazing the way every FCC chair, or at least the last 3, have been able to kick this can down the road. Ajit never mentioned universal service reform until his last month, where he said, "Oh yeah, it doubled while I was chair. I guess you all should do something about it." Jessica didn't, and Brendan, who was very vociferous and he's very politically astute, arguing continually for tech folks to pay for it. Let me see what happened in January of 2025. I'm thinking of a picture with a bunch of tech executives. I think they were at the inauguration. Anyway, my point is not a word from Brendan about contribution reform, since the tech community has, shall we say, shown a certain kind of allegiance to the president. Anyway, so nothing's going to happen. There's a bipartisan working group, not going to do anything. And the one thing I'm fairly confident will happen is sometime in the second quarter of this year, Howard Lutnick, if he still has a job, and the president will declare mission accomplished as to the digital divide. And what they mean by that, and what they'll say is, people have been talking about the digital divide for 30 years. I don't think they're going to give Larry credit. We solved it in less than a year. Now, my point is not to talk about the historical inaccuracy of that, but rather to say that will be the Republican position, which is very problematic for a lot of rural state Republicans. But nonetheless, I will predict that they will go along with that. And this is what I mean by universalism versus tribalism. If you say we have solved the rural access problem, but you think of that as the only digital divide problem, then what are you going to do about institutions? What are you going to do about new network obligations related to AI? What are you going to do about the single most important problem, which is affordability for low income? What are you going to do about training? There's a bunch of other areas that we should be working on, but we aren't. And therefore, I can safely predict nothing will happen.
Jim?
I think Blair is, as always, spot on. But I think it's, ever since this court case that Chris mentioned, one of the things they did was they separated intrastate and interstate USF contributions. So they took away half of the contribution base, the local component. And ever since then, there have been a number of big attempts to try to do this, and all have failed. I think Kevin Martin also then tried as chair to try to do USF contributions reform. And I think, one, if you listen to the last panel, I think they said it all, right? And someone told me this around, it could have been Larry a long time ago, that as long as the Constitution has the U.S. Senate, including big square rural states, and as long as the House is made up of areas based on population, it's almost impossible to happen. And there's a variety of reasons why. The FCC chair says Congress ought to do it, authorizers. Authorizer says, oh no, appropriators ought to do it. And appropriators say, oh no, FCC ought to do it. It's a hot potato. It's full of political downside. And I think the only way that you can get there is the kind of ability we had a long time ago, where you've got leadership at the top, a vision for where you want to go. And I would say that in this case, especially facts and economics data, we did just enormous numbers of fact-based data to make sure that low volume users weren't disproportionately advantaged, that we had the balance between residential subscribers and corporate subscribers. And I think that our challenge is not that the size of the telecom sector has shrunk, it's that the portion of the telecom sector to which we're applying this has shrunk. And thus, I think, the obvious answer in part is, continuing with the revenue-based, connections-based approach where you apply to all connections. But that has a whole bunch of really challenging things to go with it that make that almost impossible.
Larry, Rochelle, then Chris, if you have any.
Really quickly, Blair's made a couple of several good points today, but he made a really good point on a panel we were on about this about a month ago, that digital divide is always about three pieces: affordability, access, and utilization. One of the things that no one ever talks about is that where we are with regard to digital divide was from 2001 to 2008. If you're a Republican, you couldn't use the words digital divide. Do the Google, because I have. You will find no member of that period of time that worked for that president who ever used the term digital divide. Then net neutrality became a thing among progressive. I won't get into family fights, but I was labeled as like not caring about the people because I didn't give a crap about net neutrality. I cared deeply about digital divide. And it was kind of sotto voce. Everybody else was talking about other things. I was talking about digital divide. And then we get to 2016, and Ajit Pai did something brilliant. He took the term digital divide and made it mean one thing: rural people. And I gave a speech in Australia right after the election in 2017, and it was by accident. I was talking about the election in the United States, and I was talking about the digital divide in the United States, and I had two different slides. And I showed, one slide showed the counties that Donald Trump had won, and one slide showed where the digital divide existed, and I realized, oh my God, it's the same damn slide. And it wasn't an accident that the only thing that Ajit cared deeply about access, didn't give a damn about affordability. And we're still in having that same debate again. So I give a lot of credit to Blair, because he's gotten it, I've understood it, but we're in that. What's going to happen again is we're going to say digital divide is cured because we're going to talk about access for some Americans. We're not going to talk about affordability for all Americans, including some of the people who will have access, but unaffordable access.
Anything, Chris and Rochelle? No pressure.
Well, I guess the main thing I wanted to say is that it's in California, we did redo our universal service mechanism because we do have a state universal service fund, which is both an infrastructure fund, the CASF, and also a lifeline. And what California decided to do was to collect it on an access line basis. And that then swept in wireless and VoIP, which was significant, the cable VoIP. And so we're now kind of flush with money at this moment, which has helped us finish our broadband build on a state basis. in addition to the federal funds, which have been a little iffy. But anyway, we haven't gotten our last bead in here in California. But the last thing I wanted to say is I could not agree more about affordability. You can get access to everybody, but if they can't afford it, it's useless. So, I've been working with a nonprofit in California that does a lot of, when they try to merge, we use that incentive that they have to merge to try to get long-term commitments for affordable broadband and Lifeline in the state of California as part of their public benefits analysis. And so that kind of works. We've gotten positive things in 6 mergers, but you can't do that forever. So affordability really has to be done, and that needs to be funded somewhere. We had ACP. It seemed to have worked pretty well, but it went away. I'm not crazy about it being in appropriations. That's not a safe way to do it. So it would be better if it was through the regulatory process, in my opinion. And so we've got to resolve that.
Chris, any?
There's a lot of power in the status quo and hot potatoes. So I at least hope that there's some chance that it'll be hard to make things worse. And that counts for something. And I had an experience in this realm that helped show that. Bill asked me to do a hearing before a House committee on the E-rate, and this was expected to be Republicans coming and beating me up. And so I said, sure, I like that sort of thing. But you have to if you're going into the courts. So we get there, and the congressional team changed the tenor of this incredibly. They had these purple folders that showed each congressional district for the people there and the schools and how much money they were getting from the program. And so the people show up, and it's all of a sudden, most of them they're looking at their blue thing, and then they walk out and walk out. Turned out to not be a very difficult hearing at all.
Data. A couple of minutes we have left. I was a little selfish. I apologize. Any questions? Because I can keep going. Any questions? I mean, you're not going to get this assembly again. So any curiosities? There you go.
So unfortunately, Chip Pickering left because I asked this question privately at the last panel, but would love to hear what you guys have to say. We heard a lot about bipartisanship, both on the Hill and also at the FCC. When did the worm turn? I mean, it's so partisan now, as I well know. When did the worm turn, in your opinion?
Chris, we'll start with you. Do you have
Well, I remember in 2015, a close friend of mine who's has held a series of very high positions in Republican administrations, very high. But I won't name him. But he asked me sort of, Chris, do you know any Trump supporters? And I said, no, I don't know any Trump supporters. I mean, I'm around these people all day. We just don't see them. And he's told me, well, here's something that'll surprise you. I don't know any Trump supporters either, but they took over the Republican Party and they're still in control. That's when the worm turned, in my view.
Jim?
I do think as much as there was, this was a bipartisan act and everything about it. Look, in the summer of 1995, we threatened a veto and we were harsh and we were ready to blow this whole thing up. It was not entirely, it was a lot of push and shove along the way, and we negotiated up to the last minute. I think the question is not how we got bipartisan. I think it's the future focused question of what are the questions we should be asking now. And I think to me is, again, how do we make technology a positive force in society? Because I think these appeal to all Americans. How do we break down the walls of the classroom so that kids, regardless if they're on a school bus or at home, are able to access this whole universe of knowledge? How do we make sure that every low-income apartment building has access to free Wi-Fi, as the BEAD Act says? How do we transform the conversation from how much does it cost for someone to get online, or how much does it cost to make sure that we serve all who have an affordability process, to the question of how do we, how can we afford not having these people online? I think that's the key question for government and society.
Thanks. So we got 2 questions. If I can ask you to ask the questions back to back, and we'll finish things out right here. Right there, and then the young lady in the green who I.
Hi. I worked in Texas before I came here, and I really appreciate you all speaking about how it was in the past, right? How this is the tour of the Telecom Act. We're here sitting in this room, the young folks that may not have remembered what it was like back then. What do we do now, right? And I don't mean that in like a philosophical sense. I mean, how do we organize? Who do we organize with? And particularly, this is the question I'd like to hear you answer if possible. Who should we be looking to? What are the examples that you would like for us as folks working in this field to really be inspired by that are working today?
I'd like you to retain that question and close out, and then you can pick and choose as we end and blend whatever parting remarks you have.
I'm actually going to build on that question. So great minds think alike. 2 things that stand out to me from this panel are coalition building. You have all done, you've been successful, I think, in your work because your ability to create those systems and networks of support to push through what other barriers came up in your pathway. And also the human or storytelling component. The girl from Tennessee, pulling in civics classes and hearings. I mean, that's fantastic stuff. So to build on Cindy's question, who should we be working with from that coalition building standpoint? How should we think about it? And anything else you want to add maybe about what could maybe make a difference pulling in that storytelling opportunity?
This is going to test all of you. I'm going to start with Rochelle since her phone's going off.
Telling me that my flight is soon. So
Okay.
turn it off.
Okay. Well, so you go ahead and do that as you walk across the stage.
No, I don't quite have to go yet, but okay. So why can't I turn this off?
I don't know. Just go ahead. He'll do it for you.
Figure out how to turn my alarm off.
All right. You got
Okay,
2
so
seconds.
I wanted to answer the first question. Every member has schools and libraries in their district, and they're very valued. So part of what I tried to do when I was at Shelby was to make sure that we lobbied all of the legislators. And so there is a fly-in day that's happening next week for Shelby, where we are explaining how much money these schools, libraries, and rural healthcare get from E-rate and how important it is to their budget. Because we have to tell that story every single year to every new member so they understand what this program is. And so I want to thank Joey Wender. I know their staff is working really hard right now. John Winhausen started all of this, but that has to happen so that they have a constituency that cares about it.
Thanks, Rochelle. Chris, any of those 2 questions?
Everybody else is more qualified than me on this.
Okay. Well, thank you, Chris, just in case you don't have another word. Blair?
I would say the people in the city of Minneapolis and the people who are opposing data centers. On the people with Minneapolis, I completely agree with them. People opposing data centers, I have mixed feelings about it. But what I do understand is this: it's not coming from the national level. And Congress is absolutely not serious about AI. There is absolutely zero leadership there. It is only going to come from below. My old friend Doug Sosnick, who was Clinton's political advisor, recently on a podcast talked about AI being the hidden political thing. I think it's a huge political issue, but it's going to come from the bottom up. I deeply regret there's no national leadership I can see.
Thank you, Jim.
I do think that storytelling is key, and being able to tell a story, help people imagine what a vision can be. I think putting a face on it is finding the people who actually, like Larry talked about, the specific school and that difference and that divide. I think we've always benefited from having a specific face on things. I think I want to talk to, when I look back at these 30 years, Benton has played a huge role across this whole time. They were the first ones who thought about even things like headlines, of actually using the internet to inform internet policy. And I think those types of networks are critical. And I think the having the intellectual process that supports these things. That my sense is we're in a world now where we aren't thinking deeply. We are just thinking, oh, therefore they're against it. You know, what's the thing? And I think we need to think deeper. We need to go deep on terms of how can things actually work so that we can set up the community for success down the road.
Thank you, Larry.
I want to give some props to Shelby. I sat on their board, and the work that John and Joey does is not only, and the remaining folks on that board do, is not only important, but it's vital to what's happening in this country. But I also want to talk about two other things. A week from today, I'll be sitting down in Austin, Texas at a convening of the Historically Black College and Universities having a conference on AI. Look to, you know, the statistic that most of y'all won't believe, but nobody knows. 98% of Black students at HBCUs, 91% of their faculty use AI today. They are organizing around themselves and think about organizing, think about governance, think about how this should happen. There are a lot of young, bright people in this country who are Black, who are brown, who are Asian, who are Native American, who are going to define their own future. And AI gives them, there's some, you know, I'm going to hope they're not watching this, but I'm going to really start talking about, we need to do some consortia. We need some really deep thinking, and how do we take back our future? The future's coming. There are a lot of Afrofuturists out there who aren't thinking about AI, but there are a lot of really smart professors, university professors. There'll be 37 university professors in one place talking about how to get AI to those students. And in the same way that Kenya leapfrog money and Japan leapfrog mobile, maybe Black colleges and universities and tribal colleges and Hispanic serving institutions can do the same thing. And the last thing I want to talk about is last week and this week, I listened to one member of Congress who's the closest approximation I've seen in this Congress to my boss, Mickey Leland, and my boss, Ed Markey, and that's Janet McClellan. Never met the woman, just watched her. She's talking about rethinking the Telecommunications Act. It took us 60 years from 1934 to 1996 to get the Telecommunications Act revised. It's been 30 years since then. We're working in internet time. We don't have another 10 or 15 years. We need to rethinking it. And we need members of Congress who can get up and say, we need to do it. And here are some principles we need to be organizing about. There may be others. I just don't know. I don't spend a lot of time on the Hill. But we need to find those members who are vital, who are vibrant, who can tell the stories, and who have the commitment.
On that note, please join me in thanking our panel.